So the first order of business when trying to describe to somebody what free energy is would be to say it has some historical precedence. Nikola Tesla coined the term radiant energy, which signifies free energy. It does have a position within the body of knowledge of electrical engineering, but it's never usually covered. It's usually ignored or dismissed as being non-existent, or we already have it, all of which are lies, and I have to cover each of those points, or misrepresentations if you prefer. The first order of business is to talk about imaginary numbers. The square root of -1, it cannot be proven. Its existence is speculated to exist, but it cannot be proven, it cannot be measured, and yet using it within our mathematical equations to enumerate or evaluate the precursor to energy makes it possible. We have a working knowledge, 1.5 centuries working knowledge that cannot be proven, but it works. The math works, but just because the math works doesn't mean we can prove it. But we have demonstrated for 1.5 centuries, more or less, not precisely, but very close, with a certain degree of accuracy, a very good degree of accuracy, that this hypothetical entity called the square root of -1 actually does help us get through the math. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to. And what I create is the precursor to free energy. So it's radiant energy is not energy, and it does not radiate. But for some reason, Nikola Tesla decided to use those two words 1 century ago to describe this animal that we now call free energy in the colloquial domain. But he called it radiant energy, but it's not energy and it's not radiant, and it is freely available, though. That part is true. But it's the precursor to energy. The energy that is not freely available, the energy that comes under the domain of the conservation of energy and thermodynamic losses and conversions of one energy format into another energy format. So we want energy, but we can never have it in unbridled amounts. But we can have the precursor of energy in unbridled amounts, and if we have it at a rate greater than our demand, then for all intents and purposes, it is unlimited. Because we won't know if it's unlimited, will we? Infinity is not something we can count towards to prove it. We can't prove infinity. But we can provide ourselves the precursor to energy, namely radiant energy, at a rate far greater than what our load demands, our appliances demand. And if we consistently provide an excess, once we convert that precursor into usable energy, then for all intents and purposes, so long as that keeps up, we got unlimited energy. For all intents and purposes. So long as it's delivered at a rate greater than what we consume. But now this is a precursor to energy. It's not energy, so it can't be proven because it's predicated on the square root of -1. And most of electrical engineering, let me give you one example. The electrical engineers in charge of the electric utility grid, when they manage the grid, what they do is their biggest, most primary objective is to make sure that they don't have an excess of energy over in one area and depletion of energy in another area, such that customers complain of brownouts and blackouts, or that pole transformers or transformers at the substation should blow up somewhere else because of an excess. So they try to keep things balanced and on an even keel and stable and evenly distributed based on demand. So if the demand is high, then the supply should match, and it should not be greater than the demand nor less than. In any area of the demographics or topography of the electric utility grid and the various consumers and producers that keep the grid going. So they balance everything, and most of their job is they're balancing the precursor to energy anyway. But energy has 4 quadrants of description, conceptually speaking. And the area I deal with, radiant energy, is only one of those 4. And the area of useful energy that can be consumed is another one of those 4 areas. And then 2 of those areas are areas that electrical engineers deal with all the time to balance the grid, but they never use the area that I deal with. And so what usually is done to prevent accidentally stepping into my area is that it's suppressed. And it's suppressed by using a humongous amount of voltage based on the belief promoted by physics, or the rule of thumb. Let's call it a rule of thumb. It's not a law. They call it a law, but it's not a law. It's a rule of thumb in order to ensure the stability of our electrical way of life, to create stability and manageability so that we never accidentally fall into what I try to promote, namely free energy, radiant energy, yada yada. Now, what they promote, the ideology or rule of thumb the physicists promotes, is called you can't get a free lunch, right? You can't get energy from nowhere. You've got to get energy from somewhere else and convert it into a format that you can utilize, because it may not be in a format that you can utilize. So you convert it, you make some, you attribute some losses due to inefficiencies, and so to cover your appliances, the load, the demand that your appliances make loading up the system with various demands, you calculate how much your load is and add a little for losses, and you got to make darn sure that your supplier supplies it, that amount, slightly in excess of what your demands are. And as it turns out, that automatically ensures, guarantees the suppression of my area that I work in. So the first objective or rule of thumb, shall we say, for free energy production is to liberate free energy in the first place, because it's not liberated, it's suppressed. And it's not suppressed due to a conspiracy so much as, well, yeah, no, it is a conspiracy that a rule of thumb, an assumption that you can't get energy from nowhere and you've got to provide it in excess of your demands, and that, it turns out that actually suppresses free energy. Now, free energy doesn't come from a source per se. Free energy comes from a circuit that has capacitance and inductance. In other words, it has a capacitor, and it has, well, more than one capacitor, actually, a multiple of capacitors, at least 2, a multiple of inductances, at least 2, and coils, providing inductance. And you can pretty much provide free energy with just that. It's more or less, that's about all you need, are coils and capacitors in multiple sets, not one of each. Because if you have one of each, all you have is a tank circuit that oscillates, and that's very pretty, but that's not a free energy production device. So we can't prove it, right? We can demonstrate it with a certain working knowledge that's good for a century and a half of historical referencing, but we can't prove it, and it does not exist. Only energy exists. Free energy does not. Reactance does not. Radiant energy does not. Now, since 2 of the 4 quadrants of the conceptualization of electricity have to do with reactance, I like to consider that radiant energy is reactance of a type that's even more extreme than those 2. But it is reactance of a type because it's the reactance of capacitors and the reactance of inductors that provides for this free energy. So it must be reactance. It's just a type that we never study. In fact, most electrical engineering students don't believe it can even be possible, because the way the 2 reactances are defined that they do utilize is in terms of leading current and lagging current. And so they can't imagine current lagging more than a quarter cycle. They can't imagine it leading voltage by more than a quarter cycle. Now, what we mean by leading and lagging and the 4 quadrants of conceptualization of electricity has to do with the concept of time. When we have an oscillating circuit, like let's take 60 cycles per second, we have the voltage waves and the current waves. Well, let's just start with voltage. We have the voltage wave provided by the electric utility grid, oscillating at 60 cycles. So it rises into the positive domain and reaches its peak of amplitude, and then it falls into the negative range and reaches its trough, its lowest nadir of amplitude, 1/2 cycle later. So if it's 60 cycles, one cycle is a 60th of a second to do a complete rotation, but to go from a peak to a trough, it'll take 120th of a second in America, or 100th of a second in Europe, because they run on 50 cycles per second. So we divide up each cycle into quarter portions of time. So that would mean 240th of a second in America, or 200th of a second in Europe. And each quarter period of time, each quarter of an oscillation in time marks a domain for a certain type of energy, and we're going to be enumerating 4 types. So a leading current is the first quadrant. So we use voltage as our reference. So let's say voltage peaks at 0 degrees, top dead center of a cycle that we are beginning to enumerate. That's the 12 on the clock. If we're using a 12-hour timepiece, it'll be at the 12. So the voltage peaks there. Now, if the current peaks there, we have a maximum efficiency of the utilization of energy. And there will be no losses due to power factor, at least. No losses due to the energy being converted into reactants, namely the imaginary domain, the square root of -1, mixed up with real numbers, real energy, in a mixed state, and we'll lose it, and it won't be utilizable. But if the peak of the current peaks with the peak of the voltage right in synchronous with each other at the top dead center, 12 o'clock, we'll have maximum efficiency of the utilization of energy. There'll be other losses to consider, namely leakages of magnetism, leakages of voltage, but we won't have a leakage of electrical reactants. Conversion into electrical reactants, and then lose energy in that manner. But if we have a leading current of 90 degrees in which the peak of current runs ahead of the peak of voltage by 1/4 cycle of oscillation, which in America would be 240th of a second, 1/240th of a second, or 1/200th of a second in Europe. If the current is leading ahead of voltage by that amount of time, now we've got a maximum loss of energy leaking into the reactive field, in the sense that current is ahead of voltage by 90 degrees. Now, if current should be behind voltage by 90 degrees, that's lagging current, and again, we'll have a maximum leakage of reactants, or a maximum leakage of energy into the reactive field, the imaginary plane of numbers, and we won't be able to see or measure the loss. All we can do is infer it with our math and say, well, it disappeared. It must have gone into the reactive field, and we look at the phase angle. Oh, the current just happens to be leading or lagging by 90 degrees, the peak of voltage. The current is ahead or behind the peak of voltage by 90 degrees. So, yeah, that must be what happened. But we don't really know because we can't measure it. We can't see reactance. We can't measure it. It's invisible. It's literally invisible, yet the math works out. If we look at the precursor, the signs, the indications of what's going on, we can deduce what probably is going on. And if we make correction for that with various methods that are called power factor correction methods, we can stop the leakage of the conversion of real power into reactive power. And it's, see? That must have been where it was going because we corrected it with the right solution, so that must have been the problem. So this is all based on inferencing and implications and trial and error, and we get this working knowledge that works most of the time, but we can't prove most of what we're doing in the field of electrical engineering. So when physicists say free energy doesn't exist, they're not wrong, but they're not sharing with us their full body of knowledge. The job description of an electrical engineer literally dabbles, or it spends a lot of time in, not just dabbling, in an area that can't be proven, electrical reactants. Now, I name 2. Leading current can only lead by 90 degrees. It can't lead any more than that. So how can we have current leading voltage by 180 degrees or lagging, for that matter, by 180, which amounts to the same thing, by 1/2 cycle? How can we do that? 1/120th of a second. Current the peak of current separated from the peak of voltage by 1/2 cycle, by 120th of a second, or by 100th of a second in Europe. How can we do that? We've already reached the limit on the leading or lagging current by 1/4 cycle, plus or minus. How can we go to 180 degrees of separation between the peak of current and the peak of voltage? Well, there's a trick to it. And this is a rule of thumb that I learned by trial and error, because I approached this problem 5 years ago on simulators using the Edison approach. I know nothing, which is true. When I first started out, I knew nothing. And I took every single parameter I could think of and modified it, plus or minus, left or right, whatever it took, and to see what would happen. And after a while, I learned certain things, and then I started to spend less time with trial and error and more time successfully creating a new version of a circuit that would create free energy. So all these little tricks of the trade I learned, but I learned them because I taught them to myself with the help of the simulator. No one could teach me because it's not written up in a book, and you can't take a class in it, and physics denies it. Says you can't get energy from nowhere. Now, that's an open thought I started and I didn't finish. Where is this energy coming from? It comes from capacitance and inductance, and it's coming from the circuit itself. So the circuit becomes its own source. But we do need an input of energy from the outside to get things going. We do need that. But we don't need that to sustain what's going on. Once it gets started, we could cut off the outside supply of energy, and the thing should keep running and producing infinite power and fry itself and destroy itself if we don't regulate it. Okay, so where does it come from? It comes from capacitance and inductance, which is in a framework of time. Reactance exists in time. It does not exist in space, even though our coils and our capacitors exist in space. But the capacitance of a capacitor and the inductance of a coil does not exist in space. It exists in what Eric Dollard likes to call counter space, the realm of imaginary numbers, complex numbers. It exists in a field of knowledge that cannot be proven whether or not it exists. And at the very least, we can say it does not exist because we can't measure it. So it is very important we understand why physicists like to say that free energy does not exist. They're not lying, but they're not telling us the whole truth, that their job description as electrical engineers deals very heavily in energy which does not, a form of energy which does not exist. And because it does not exist as energy, it's reactance, it's not power, it does not come under the jurisdiction of conservation of energy because it's not energy. You can't even measure it, even prove that you conserved it. And thermodynamics has nothing to do with it because you wouldn't be able to measure to prove that you lost or saved energy. You couldn't. There'd be no way. You can't measure it, so how can you prove it? Sorry. All right. All you can do is infer and imply, and that's innuendo. That's gossip. That's rumor, yet it works. The math, a century and a half of the math works, all because Descartes came up with, that French mathematician and philosopher, Descartes. He came up with imaginary numbers, and it works. It works for a lot of things, but in this particular, different subjects of human endeavor, but in this endeavor of electrical engineering, it works very nicely. Yet we can't prove them. Anyway, so where does the free energy actually come from? I say it comes from reactance, but that doesn't really explain the details. That's just a very vague overview, and that's fine. If all you want to do is a vague overview description, that's fine and dandy. But, I'm curious, and some people are curious, well, what are the details? Where does it really come from? All right, now we're getting into the details. So one of the rules of thumb I learned early on was don't suppress the production of radiant energy, the precursor to energy. Don't suppress it. Now, once we produce radiant energy, in which the current is separated from the voltage by 180 degrees, 1/2 cycle of oscillation, and it won't be a sine wave. It'll be spikes or triangle waves, depending on how the time compression, the perspective of time compression works when you view the thing. If you view a lot of time of oscillations or very little time of oscillations, very few oscillations, they'll separate if it's very few and look like triangle waves, or they might be regulated triangle waves, they might be irregular triangle waves. But if you have a lot of time and you're trying to look at a huge time frame of many, many oscillations of current separated by voltage by 180 degrees, by 1/2 cycle, it'll look like spikes, regardless of whether it's spikes or whether it's triangle waves. Let's see. Well, I lost that train of thought. All right. So where does it come from, the details? Well, so what you have to do, what I learned by trial and error, so I can't say why, I just say this is the way things are. You don't want to feed a sine wave of power to stimulate the circuit to produce this free energy. You don't want to feed too much in there. Because what turns out to happen is that the real energy, the energy that's conserved and has to be addressed by thermodynamics, that actually suppresses the production of this radiant energy, this precursor to energy. And when I say it's a precursor, that includes the other two reactive quadrants of the 4 quadrants of electricity. The leading current and the lagging current are also precursors of electricity too. Taken individually, capacitive reactance is an ingredient of electricity. Inductive reactance is another ingredient, and we can call them forces of nature, which we infer or imply, but we can't prove that they exist. But they are. We can call them forces, and we can call them ingredients of electricity, and when they are synchronized with no separation between the peak of... See, when we measure capacitive reactance, or I should say when we measure the the impact that capacitive reactance has had on electricity, we'll be measuring voltage. And when we measure the impact that inductive reactance has had on electricity, we'll be measuring current. But only when the two are combined. So you have to have some voltage and some current in some proportionality of mixture in order to have anything capable of being measured. And what we'll end up measuring is watts. That's Ohm's law. Current times voltage equals watts. And I always wondered when I first learned about Ohm's law 30 years ago, why is it multiplied? Why does current times voltage equal watts? Why not add? Because if they were added or subtracted, you could separate them and still measure the watts, but we can't. If we separate them, we can't measure watts. So we have to always have them together to measure power. Else we have no power. But they can be separated, but we can't measure them when they're separated. We can only infer or imply that they are still existential, but we can't measure them, so we say they're virtual. It's a virtual reality of existence that cannot be measured. It can only be implied or inferred. And energy seems to come out of the union of those two forces in a framework of time. So we have 3 factors to electricity: time, capacitive reactance, and inductive reactance. In fact, well, I don't want to get too off topic. I will get a little bit off topic into quantum physics, but I prefer... The atom can be redefined in electrical engineering terms. It can be done. And this is a little off topic, but I can't help myself, sorry. The neutron has to do with frequency. The proton has to do with capacitive reactance combined with frequency, and the electron combined with frequency has to do with, inductive reactance combined with frequency has to do, inductive reactance, which actually includes frequency, has to do with the electron and the neutron. So the atom, which is normally defined in 3 pieces, the neutron, proton, and electron, from an electrical engineer standpoint, the neutron doubles, it's shared between the electronic inductive reactive force, and the neutron is also shared with the protonic capacitive reactant force. It's shared between the two of them. And the frequency, as I say, can be askew. The peaks of one and the peak of the other can be separated by a quarter cycle plus or minus, or a half cycle, or they can be in union. When they're in union, we have total energy, total atomic existence. But when they're separated, we start to lose the energy, lose the atom, and it starts to fade away. It starts to become invisible to one degree or another. Now, the maximum invisibility is 0 power factor, which is a quarter cycle plus or a quarter cycle minus. But when we get to 180, it actually pops back into visibility again. But with a very strange anomaly, that the current is opposed to the voltage. And this is what we have in a black hole, in which light turns around and goes back to the gravitational center of that star because the current is reversed to the voltage. The voltage pressure is busy wanting to push the light out, but the light decides, no, I'm going to turn around and go back into the center in the opposite direction to the way the voltage wants me to move, and we end up with a black hole. Is it due to gravity, or is it due to this reversal phenomenon of current, this radiant energy? Either explanation is completely valid. A physics version and an electrical version, electrodynamic version. They're both valid. Anyway, so in order to create this radiant energy, getting back on topic now that I've spent a little time in quantum physics, to let you know why I don't like it that physicists tell electrical engineers what to believe and what not to believe. And the patent office is chiming in as well. They don't want to even look at a free energy circuit. So it's the definition of perpetual motion is erroneous because it assumes no input of energy, and that's false. You must have some input, but it doesn't have to be a whole lot, and it does not have to be continuous. You can have it just in the beginning to get it going. Just like the old Model Ts or Model Ts from Ford, Henry Ford, you had to use a crank to get the motor going because there was no starter motor. Usually nowadays we have an electric starter motor to get the thing going because conventional ICEs, internal combustion engines, requires somebody to hand crank it or electric motor crank it to get it started, and then once it gets going, it can continue to go, provided you keep giving it gas. But you have to get it going initially with an input of energy that's not from the gas tank. And this is how a free energy device works that I study, is that you have to get it started. You can keep it going, but you don't have to. In some cases you have to. And it doesn't have to be an oscillating wave that you send into it, a sine wave. It can be a DC, but the wattage has to be really small. It has to be nanowatts or picowatts. Do you know what a nano or a pico is? In scientific notation, a pico number, a pico value, is 12 place values to the right of the decimal point. So you're going to have 11 zeros and then a 1 or a 2 or a 3. 12 place values to the right of the decimal point. That's a pico. 9 positions to the right of the decimal point, that's a nano. That's the kind of range of wattage you have to stay down under or within the window of in order not to suppress the production of free energy, the precursor to energy, radiant energy, the precursor to energy. You have to stay down there, or else you're going to suppress its production. That's just the way it is. For some reason, energy suppresses this style of reactance that goes overboard, that causes current to be separated by voltage by 180 degrees. So this is just the nature of the beast. You just have to follow these rules of thumb and let somebody else try to figure it out, or maybe they can't. Maybe it's not provable. In any case, so you feed your circuit a sine wave or a DC wave that's very tiny, or a DC non-wave that's very tiny wattage, let's say a nanowatt. And you also have to make sure that at least one of the two components, namely the current or the voltage, has to be down in the range of like micro, or something like that. Because so Nano is the square of a micro. You know, if you take a micro value and square it, it becomes nano. So 6 place values to the right of the decimal point, when you square it, it becomes 12. A micro becomes a pico. Actually, a nano, not a nano, a micro becomes a pico. So we're dealing with micro values of current and voltage, and we're dealing with pico or nano values of wattage. So both the current and the voltage have to be very low. And there are various techniques for doing that. If, let's say, you have a 3-volt output sine wave generator, your digital version you get from Amazon, if it works to use digital, I don't know. Maybe you need a rotary version, but regardless. Let's say you have 3 volts coming out of this thing, or 12 volts if you use an alternator from a car, a rotary device. You have to throw away most of that voltage using, I sometimes like to use current division. You can use voltage division. If you use current division or voltage division, you have to have an extra ground to go out to bleed away and waste away that energy. It can't be common ground. It has to be earth-style ground, so you get rid of it. But this other rule of thumb, so that's the first rule of thumb. The second rule of thumb is that you must not encourage the flow of current, because when current is askew from voltage by 180 degrees, it's not flowing anymore. We have a standing wave. In fact, the way to visualize this, conventional current, when the peak of current and the peak of voltage are in alignment, 0 degrees of separation between them, let's say we have a circuit, a loop of wire. The current's going to go around that loop of wire, and it may oscillate if it's an oscillating current, 60 cycles. The amplitude will go up and down, but it travels the circumference of that loop. And it's not what I do, because it'll create a ripple, basically. We'll see a ripple, like dominoes. We'll see this ripple that runs around, except with dominoes it happens once and that's it. In this case, it keeps going around and around for each cycle, for each successive cycle. So it's oscillating, and it's not oscillating, but it's going around this loop of wire, and that's not what we want. So in the case of oscillation, instead of the thing oscillating as it travels the circumference of this loop of wire, we want it to bounce off all of the loop, the energy, the electrical energy within the entire loop of wire, all of it bounces off the periphery of that circumference and moves into the center, what we would normally call the center of gravity of an object, but in this case it's the center of gravity of electricity. So it goes into the center and then echoes off the center and bounces off and goes back out to the periphery to start the cycle of bouncing all over again, or to continue the cycle. So it's each half cycle, it's bouncing off the periphery and the center simultaneously throughout the entire circumference of that loop of wire. That's a standing wave, in the sense that it's not standing because it's bouncing inwards and outwards in a radial fashion, but not in a circumferential fashion. So it's not circulating in a circumference anymore. And so from the standpoint of the loop that's out at the outermost edge, the periphery of that circumferential or radial view of a circuit, it doesn't look like it's rotating anymore. It doesn't look like it's following the pathway of the wire. In fact, it looks like it's standing still. But from a bird's eye view above this circle, if we look at the field created by that loop, we'll see it bounce off the field. The peak of the field will bounce off the periphery and go back to the center, and bounce off the center and go back to the periphery. Now, and we'll see, if we had more than the eagle's eye view, if we had Superman X-ray view and could see the invisible that cannot be seen, we would see the reactive, the inductive reactance, what we would have measured as current if it was put together with capacitive reactance measured as voltage. But since they're separated, we can't say it's voltage and current, but be that as it may, the simulator still thinks of it as current and voltage, even though they're separated by 180 degrees. So it sees it because it implies it. It doesn't see it, it implies it. it infers it because it strictly deals with the math. It doesn't deal with the real world. It just deals with the math. And so it can cover both territories, the real and the non-real, the area that we can only infer with mathematics. So the simulator doesn't give us any blind spots. The real world gives us blind spots. So from a simulator's perspective, it'll see the peak of current at the moment of time that it bounces off the periphery. The peak of voltage is bouncing off the center. And a half cycle later, they switch places. And at a quarter cycle, they cross in the middle between the center and the periphery. And that's considered the midline tracing of an oscilloscope tracing. That's the midline when they cross. But the nadir will designate as the center and the periphery as the peak. And so the current peak and the voltage peak are always out of phase by a half cycle, which means they're doing the opposite at the same time. So unless they cross at the midline. But that's zero value, it's neither positive nor negative. So just because they cross and meet each other doesn't mean it's useful, because again, it's zero. It's zero energy, so we can't do anything there. We better not hang out there. Now, so these are the two criteria, the two rules of thumb. We have to give it a scant amount of power to get this thing initiated, this process that I'm going to describe shortly. I still haven't described it. And then we also have to create this pattern of oscillation that is effectively a standing wave. So that once we try to transmit it along a transmission line, we'll only need one to guide it to a certain point out somewhere away from the power station circuit to the load. We will not need a return wire because we never sent it. That's the funny thing. If we sent it, we'd need a return to bring it back, but to create the complete cycle. But we're not doing that. We're intentionally causing the energy not to follow the pathway of a loop. Instead, it oscillates from the outer periphery of a loop to the center of gravity of that loop, back out to the periphery. So those are our two rules of thumb. Now, the mathematics describes how this happens, or it shows us what's happening. When we deal with reactive power, which is not really power, when we deal with electrical reactance, it's enumerated with complex numbers. A complex number is a union by way of subtraction or addition between a real number and an imaginary number. And a real number is some multiple of the number 1. It could be 1.5. The imaginary number is some multiple of the square root of -1. It could be 1.5 square root times the square root of -1. But they're added together or they're subtracted, and that's a complex number because reactance is usually a mixture of real power and reactive power. It's a mixture of the two. And they're in certain proportionalities depending on the amplitude of the real versus the amplitude of the imaginary portion. Now, one of the rules of thumb I told you was that the input of real power has to be very, very, very low. That means the real number of a complex number, and every generator produces a complex value. People like to say we already have current separated by voltage by 180 degrees. It's in our electrical generators, but that's a lie. Only under simulation is that the case. Whether it's the voltage source, let's say, is a battery generating DC, or a sine wave generator generating sine waves. In a simulator environment, which is virtual reality, it has been engineered to be that way, that the current is separated from the voltage by 180 degrees, by 1/2 cycle. But in the real world, that never happens. It never happens because we don't allow it to happen. And we don't design it that way. Let's take, for instance, our batteries. It's not designed to be that way. And our, what's it called? The rotary generators at the hydroelectric power plant, let's say, or the nuclear power plant for that matter, being rotated by steam turbines. Those rotary generators are putting out a lagging current. of minus 90 degrees power factor, of negative zero power factor, because the current is lagging the voltage by 90 degrees. And although the Berkeley Spice family of simulators does not depict that, they depict current averse from voltage by 180 degrees. In Paul Falstad's simulator, that was the first simulator I started to use, and his is a real world depiction in which current is lagging voltage by 90 degrees in his among his sine wave generators. His voltage source is generating sine wave power. So that's actually the way it works. So some electrical engineers say, well, we already have current averse from voltage by 180 degrees, so we don't need a fourth quadrant to designate the four quadrants of electricity. But the reality is we don't, and we suppress the fourth quadrant. It never happens in the real world. It only happens in the world of the Berkeley Spice family of various versions of simulators, such as Microcap or LT Spice or P Spice or NG Spice, or all these different spice values, spice versions of the Berkeley Spice model of simulators. So we have these two rules of thumb. Okay, so now we get into the complex numbers. So when a voltage source is producing a sine wave, it's going to be a complex enumeration in which there's going to be some real power and combined with some reactive power. The real power will be enumerated by the real number portion of a complex number, and the reactive power will be enumerated by the value of the imaginary component of a complex number. And so we have this proportionality mixture of real power and reactive power coming out of an electric generator at the hydroelectric power plant. Now, when I use that to feed my little circuit to get it running, I want to make sure the real power is humongously small in the area of nanowatts or picowatts, and the imaginary portion is very high. But I don't need a lot. I just need, the reactionary portion can be low also. The only important thing is that the real portion is low, because it's going to get in the way. There's a third rule of thumb here. I'm going to have to explain. Just give it as it is. There's no proof behind it. It's just the way it is. The third rule of thumb is that the definition of a voltage source, or the analogous definition of a voltage source, a source of voltage, is a voltage regulator. So that when you have the presence of voltage, it tends to regulate the system. And when you have more of it, it does a better job of stabilizing that system. When you have less of it, it does less of a good job of stabilizing the voltage of that system. And so this is how you can get an anomalous rise of voltage, is by not feeding it enough on a continuous basis. And it costs money to do that. So it costs money to keep the system stable, the electric utility grid stable, because you got to feed it all. That's a rule of thumb, though. That's not a law of physics that you can't get energy from nowhere. That's simply a rule of thumb, that if you want stability, then you have to give it. But it's taken on this, now it's a law, It's no longer a rule of thumb. Well, if you want to keep your job. So the third rule of thumb is that the alternate definition for a voltage source is a voltage regulator. But if we reduce the real number portion of a complex number of what's coming out of a generator or a source of voltage, if we reduce the real number of value to nanowatts or picowatts, then it doesn't matter how much power we feed a free energy circuit. It can be a nanowatt or a picowatt, and it'll be just fine, because then the reactance will self-feed itself. Each cycle of iteration of electrical reactance, the output will become the input for the next cycle, because it's lossless. It can't go anywhere. It can't be converted or lost under the rules of thermodynamics, and so it cannot be conserved. It just builds on itself like a snowball rolling. Our oscillator rolls in conceptual time for each cycle, and it keeps building up at an exponential rate, and the exponential rate can change. it can get worse. It can be a nice smooth hyperbolic, and then all of a sudden take off and be practically a vertical ascension or a vertical dive in the positive or negative direction away from midline. It can do some really nasty things and explode on you. But the point is, you can't go anywhere because it's lossless. And so it accumulates. And this is in the field surrounding the capacitor, the field surrounding the coil of wire. The coil and the capacitor provides the initial quantity of inductance and capacitance, but once they generate a field of reactive energy or non-energy, a field of reactance surrounding that component, it'll be in the complex number frame. Part of it is going to be imaginary. Hopefully most of it's going to be imaginary and very little of it's going to be real if we set things up properly. So most of it's going to be imaginary, which means we can't see it. It's invisible. We can only infer it mathematically with the help of the square root of -1, which we can't prove either, or also. That field, that imaginary field, component of the complex field is going to keep growing at an exponential rate. And the real component of that complex field is going to continue to diminish or be constant. If we use a pre-charged capacitor, then it will diminish. But if we keep feeding in, it'll stay the same, but it'll become dwarfed at an exponential rate of dwarfability. Because the imaginary portion of the complex field is going to keep growing at an exponential rate. And if the real portion remains the same or diminishes, then this thing is going to get out of hand, because at some point the resistances of the coils, for instance, are going to start converting that lossless imaginary power or non-power into real power. Resistance is the easiest way to do the conversion, and the wire does have some resistance. So now we're going to get a heating of the coil, and it might even start to melt, or the insulation on the coil or the dielectric in the capacitor might crack, and then we'll get sparks going off between the two plates, shorting out the two plates of the capacitor, and it'll start to ruin our circuit and damage it, and then eventually destroy it in a puff of smoke. And one guy on the internet I read about over a decade ago, he literally could time on his watch with a second accuracy how long it would take for his circuit to destroy itself, because that's all it was good for. He didn't design it to regulate this exponential growth of free energy or radiant energy. So it just grew until the resistances got in the way and heated up sufficiently to cause breakage or melting, and the whole circuit just fried itself and no more free energy. So this is how we get it to grow. We have to not suppress it. And we have to usually, I think, there has to be a minimum of 2 capacitances and 2 inductors. And you don't have to have capacitors to have capacitance. You can have a multiple of inductors creating various mutual inductances, which by their very nature, they will automatically create mutual capacitances at the same time as they create mutual inductances. So you could have just coils. And I think his name was Don Smith. He worked this way. He had a bunch of coils undergoing mutual inductances as their primary objective, but as a side effect, they were also going to create, you can't help it, they'll create mutual capacitances. So he had multiple capacitances going on, multiple inductances, and that's all you need. You need at least 2 of each. And it creates what's called an LMD module, a Eric Dollar's analog computer, a longitudinal magnetodielectric module. And if you daisy chain them together, that's one way to create free energy. You have to have a minimum inductance, though, and a minimum of capacitance. And that was my first success, my breakthrough. I think I have the shortcut is.gd/overunity_breakthrough. I believe is the shortcut to that circuit on my website in Paul Falstad's simulator. I think the capacitances were 10 farads each, and the inductances were 300 henries each. They were transformer pairs of coils. Anyway, So this is, in a nutshell, how we describe the production of the precursor to free energy, which is radiant energy, because we're not dealing with energy, and we're not dealing with standard conventional electrical reactants. We're dealing with I'm sorry, I missed one thought. So what happens is when a simulator evaluates what's going on, it uses various formulas and equations that are conventional wisdom among electrical engineers. And at some point within the computation of what's taking place per unit of time within the domain of the simulator's virtual environment of time, it will square. Something will get squared. And when a complex number is squared, you have a polynomial of two, what are they called? Two coefficients. One will be imaginary and the other will be real. And when the real is squared against itself, we still end up with real. So that'll be real power that's been squared. It might increase if it's an integer, it might decrease if it's a fraction, but regardless, it's still a real number. So that stays within the domain of thermodynamics and conservation of energy. The cross product between the imaginary component of this polynomial and the real coefficient, the real coefficient and the imaginary coefficient, the cross product twice, will give us a complex result. And so that we can shove to one side. That's going to be inferred by the math, but we can't see it. The last thing to square will be the squaring of the imaginary component of this polynomial that we call a complex number. And when that imaginary portion squares against itself, multiplies against itself, it's going to create a negative value of itself. And that negative value is what causes the current to become inverted from the voltage by 180 degrees. So an electrical engineering student from South Africa was complaining to me recently, well, you can't get 180 degrees inversion of current relative to voltage. It's impossible. The maximum amount that you can shift current away from voltage is 90 degrees, plus or minus. Well, this is how you get it to happen. You have to follow all the rules of thumb, the two of them, and you have to keep in mind the third one, that's just a definition, an analogous definition of voltage source. It's not a thing you do, it's a thing you keep in mind so that you understand what voltage regulation or voltage sourcing amounts to. Is voltage regulation is another job, another role that a voltage source services in a circuit. It doesn't just supply voltage, it also regulates it based on how much you are supplying. More or less of voltage results in more or less regulation. But we deregulate the circuit to a certain degree so that we can allow this precursor to free energy, namely this radiant energy, to come forth and erupt at an exponential rate. And it's because of the squaring process that it happens, that current becomes inverted from voltage in the first place. It's because it's going to happen. We're going to be squaring a complex number, and when we do that, 1/4 of the output of the various squarings and cross multiplications will be a negative value. And to help us visualize that, because I'm talking, not describing it on a whiteboard, if we call the real number component the A coefficient of a polynomial, and the imaginary component of a complex number is the B coefficient of a polynomial, then the A gets squared, the A times the B times the A, and the B squared. We'll have 4 products, 2 squares and 2 cross products, that become our new complex number for a squaring process. And one of those 4 products will be the squaring of the imaginary portion, which will not give us an imaginary number. Only the cross products, the 2 cross products, will do that. But the squaring of the imaginary component of a complex number will give us a negative real number. And that's why the current inverts relative to the voltage. We normally call it negative resistance, but I prefer to call it negative current, which is a conventional analogous term for negative resistance, is negative current. And it's really the more accurate way to describe it.
The smelting of copper ore and other metallic ores gave us an opportunity to learn about the electrodynamic behavior of the atom that was shrouded in mystery, especially among all of the other substances that atomic matter can manifest or exhibit, such as stone, glass, wood, all these substances other than smelted metallic ores. Smelted metallic ores gave us an opportunity to learn about electrodynamics, and in the course of doing so, we will eventually admit to ourselves that it is not a mystery called physics, it's a mystery called electrodynamics, because the science of electrodynamics explains physics. It explains physical materiality, but in a way that is only obvious among smelted metallic ores that obviously behave in an electrodynamic manner, because everything else other than smelted metallic ores does not. It just doesn't give us the ability to understand what's going on with the atom, and so we think it's something mysterious. We call it physics, and we call the physicist we treat the physicist as if he's a priest engaging in creed and dogma. And do you believe in his religious belief? Because we don't see it. We don't see electrodynamics in wood or stone or even though electrodynamics does exist in things like glass and plastic, but it's an aspect of electrodynamics that does not conduct electricity. It stores charge. It stores potential. Anyway, so this model of the atom becomes obvious when we turn an about face from the vantage point of electrodynamic theory, and we start to look at physics in a new way, our physical reality. We already know that electrical behavior is part and parcel to all of chemistry. We already know this, but we never admit that, take it one step further and admit that electrodynamics is part of quantum physics. We won't even go there. We don't even think to go there. Now, this is all very crucial to admit to, because it changes physical reality into something much more accessible. We can literally do electrodynamic alchemy, perform it. There is a technique for doing that, and we will rediscover it and re-implement it because it's a timeless knowledge. It never dies, just people forget. They go back to ignorant state of suffering for lack of technology. All we have to do is look at the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, because they made use of technologies such as concrete and sewage systems and aqueducts to carry water around, and they had bathhouses for people to bathe and be sanitary. They had a little different standards than ourselves. They had mixed gender bathing, and they had their toilets on the side of the street, all lined up in a row. You sat down next to somebody else, whoever that might be, to use the toilet. And they crucified people, and they put them to death in the Colosseum. They were a little bizarre, a little violent, but they were very efficient because they were technologically savvy. They made use of technology, and that increases efficiency, and it diminishes at least suffering due to the inconvenience of not having technology available to ourselves. People suffered for other reasons, because the Roman people were kind of brutal, to put it mildly, if you broke the rules or won disfavor but among your peers. But they were technologically advanced. And as soon as they went bye-bye, we started having the plague, and all these things because of lack of basic sanitary technology. It's really bizarre. The basic things we take for granted, it's so easy to lose. Anyway, it's easy to lose this knowledge of the atom. And I have read reports that the Atlanteans of Atlantis had this knowledge. They did not have digital electronics because they did not have an intellect. They could not analyze things. They learned by way of trial and error, intuition. They were very close to nature and the nature sprites who taught them everything. And they had very long lifespans, because up until 5,000 years ago, or I should say, it really, the lifespan of the human actually started to diminish around 10,000 years ago. But it became very obvious that the close of a prior era happened around 5,000 years ago. And now we're lucky if we reach 100 years. But in the prior era, the average lifespan was 1,000 years, average. So they had a lot of time on their hands to learn from nature. So they really didn't need an intellect. We need it to accelerate our learning. Yeah, you learn faster when you have an intellect, but that doesn't make you a better person necessarily. Anyway, so we can think too much of ourselves, be a little pompous and proudful just because we have an intellect, and prior eras of human history did not have access to the intellectual capacity. So what, Anyway, so you can develop technology anyway. It just won't be the same. So we've got computers, right? And we've got CCD photocell light sensors to create technologies and techniques that nobody ever had before, and microtechnology that nobody ever had before. So nanotechnology. So it is interesting in a sense, but not really, because we're still very slowly erupting or growing out of our dark age period of not knowing what the atom actually is. It's really made up of two forces of space and one force of time, and that's it. And it explains electrodynamics, but it also explains physics, depending on whether we're dealing with smelted metallic ores or not, as the case may be.